Oh,
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah. There we go.
All right, cool.
How you doing, bro? Welcome.
I'm good, man. How you doing?
A little parched because I talked too long, but I'm doing all right.
It's all good. I seen that you started this session called the Smoke. I don't know. Is this your version of what Sakari does? Because Sakari had a series before you had your smoke session series where there was
apparently they did. It's always possible. Like Helen Keller, she had a situation where later in her life, Helen Keller couldn't
hear, and she was mute.
Where she gave a speech, and in the speech, she said a line she thought was original to her that actually they said, "Hey, this is plagiarized," and it frightened her for the rest of her career. So it's always possible. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I saw Sakari's thing. And somehow I was like, let's do that same thing. But I can tell you from the bottom of my heart, and I don't care what they say because they're never going to believe me. That's fine. It's always possible. So I'm saying I could have pulled a Helen Keller where that is possible. I did not remember things for a second. I could tell you the exact true inspiration. What happens is I did two things on Mark 16, 2 weeks in a row. And I was getting all these King James onlyists coming at me, like just nonstop in the live chat, on the comment section, and messages. And it was funny because it's like not a group I really dealt with a whole bunch before. And it's like, gosh, man, they're bringing the smoke. They just want to come on. They're coming at me hard. And I was like, plus I got, some of these new messages by some of these Muslims guys starting channels just to expose things I've done to Islam. And then there's these, and I was like, man, everybody wants smoke. And to me, it was just like, I especially wanted to get the King James onlyist guys on. They were the main one I was hoping would come on, at least in the beginning when I did it. I was like, I'm not going to respond to all these ones. I'll just have them all come on saying I want all the smoke that can come. And if you look at the original description of the first one, it specifically says King James onlyist. It says Hebrew Israelites too, but it says that for that. But Sakari didn't invent "we want the smoke." People been saying,
we know that's a idiom that's used in pop culture now, because that's something that was introduced to it from the Black community. You know what I'm saying? It was something that developed in the urban setting and made its way mainstream and into pop culture and now into hip hop. You know what I'm saying? So it's not nothing that nobody has exclusive rights on. I was just asking, just to start off on a light note, to say, hey, was that your play on of what they put down?
There was this time I remember where I did a thing called an Urban Apologetics Symposium, and I remember a guy like next week after doing a symposium too. You remember that?
That don't count. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I think it was his name, DivineProspect.
Yeah, that's him.
I think that was the guy who did that symposium the next week. So I mean, look, sometimes it is like that, but at the same time, I'm gonna do it for now and see. I might end up doing it every other week. I might not even do it all the time. I don't know, man. Just
I hope you get some atheists and Muslims in here. Especially with Dunamis was speaking. In regards to, your critique that you take for a lot of the satirical videos you make on Islam and Hebrew Israelism. And, a lot of people don't like it, but some people do enjoy it. You know what I'm saying? It's mostly Christians and they see it as comedy. But when it affects somebody's way of life, they feel like you're mocking them. Right. So like me, I don't take it personal because I'm just like, OK, well, I know to expect this from you. Right. And I know sincerely you don't mean to be really wicked or evil in doing it. It's just a way of how you do evangelism. And even some other Christian ministries has also denounced it. I'm not going to say no names, simply because they feel that that's not a very effective way to do evangelism, right? It's not showing sensitivity to the cultural norms of that populace, and they feel that it's distasteful, you know what I'm saying? But again, it's relative. And if you're able to successfully achieve your goals by doing it, then I mean, it's there, you know what I'm saying? But I hope that the people who are offended by it can have a dialogue with you and the ice be broken, because that would be on the table, and to say to you, how effective are these videos? If your materials is effective, then that's one thing. But if it causes more outrage than it is sincerely driving people to salvation, then that may be a problem. You know what I'm saying? So it's all how you want to float your boat, So that's just speaking on what Dunamis said, you know what I'm saying? And that's an interesting name. That guy said he's out here in Atlanta, so I would love to hook up with him and have a discussion. You know what I'm saying? So that's the power from on high, right? Dunamis.
Power.
All right. So since it's the smoke room, there's a couple of things I'd like to dialogue with you about. Again, we're going to keep it respectful, you know what I'm saying? And just like when I do my Freestyle Friday session, any and everybody comes in there. You know what I'm saying? I don't know who's coming in there with what doctrine, theology, disposition, or whatever, and I just take it. You know what I'm saying? So there's a couple of things I'm gonna throw out there for us, a dialogue that I've never had the opportunity to really talk to you about, and I don't want it to be too prolonged because I know you probably want to bring on other guests if anybody decides to join in, or people maybe want us to just go back and forth. I mean, it's up to you. You know, it's your show. But I did want to speak to you on something that was, I think, pertinent in regards to the Hebrew Israelite stance and some Christian stance, right? If I recall, if I'm wrong, correct me, that you said that the New Testament church has replaced Israel in regards to certain prophecies. Is that correct?
Well, I generally don't use the word replaced, but I would generally use the word fulfilled.
Substitute.
I would usually use the word fulfilled, but basically the idea would be like this. If you picture an hourglass, the answer is yes, in essence, what you're saying. So I'm not running around it, but it would be like a picture an hourglass and you have all the promises to the patriarchs and sort of the top half of it. And as the sand run down, there's that narrow part in the middle of the hourglass. And for interpretive methodology, for what I think the Bible presents of how you should look at scripture as a whole, that middle part is Christ. So everything, large, small, filtered through that small little part right there. It runs through it there. There's that bottleneck. And that bottleneck in regards to how you exegete the text is Christ. And that would be backed up with the main one, of course, would be in Luke, of course, to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. It's so clear and explicit, but that's not all. You have plenty of examples where Paul does this in regards to the model that he does his exegesis, not just that story in Luke, but other examples. So, and then you get to the other side and they're all filtered through Christ. And so the church is simply the continuation of God's people. So a lot of times when you hear me, and you can catch this, so this isn't some trick I'm doing, I will a lot of times not only say Israel in the Old Testament, a lot of times I like the phrase God's people. And the reason is to have the continuation of the identification with the new covenant believers as well, as the promises are expanded out as they were always intended to, according to the Abrahamic promise. And so there's a lot of Christians who don't agree with that either. And I'm not the expert. I don't necessarily bash people in the head. I work with a guy named Jeff Cran. You may have seen him. He and I met at a seminary. We had vociferous disagreements about this. He's a Messianic believer. He does not agree at all. He even wrote some articles on why he thinks what he calls, now we don't agree with that, what he calls replacement theology can be dangerous. And so him and I are still friends. I get it. I read his article. I respect it. Okay. You know what I mean? But that used to be, the thing is, I was that guy before, though, because of the way I grew up and what I heard and your options are sometimes limited to what you see presented in front of you. Exactly. You don't know the menu is larger. You know what I'm saying? And when you're exposed to other things, like, well, actually, it's not a matter of taste for me. You know, it's a matter of, well, this may be less comfortable, but this seems more right. So in essence, but I would say fulfilled. You know, the church is the fuller fulfillment of the promises made to God's people in the Old Testament.
So you subscribe to what's called fulfillment theology, correct? Because a lot of Calvinists that I've spoken to, when it comes to this term of replacement theology, replacement is very sensitive and they don't like that term a lot. So they like to really substitute it with the term fulfillment because it makes it more, I would say, palatable, right? More digestible. And it doesn't sound like there's a change, a drastic change in regards to the way that God deals with his people in general. So would you say you subscribe to fulfillment theology?
Yes, but not, I don't call it fulfillment theology. I call it covenant or new covenant theology.
Okay.
Or specifically, and I've talked about this, progressive covenantalism. Here's what happened. Reform folks have always majored on the fact of the Bible was taking place in these covenants taking place in history. They've always made that a big part of how they interpret the scripture, right? And so historically, that's sometimes been called, will you embrace covenant theology? And generally speaking, the covenant theology were different than the later folks who sometimes would be called dispensationalists, who saw sort of a bifurcation between Israel and the church. And the covenant theologians weren't really about that. But the problem is you had a wide umbrella under covenant theology. So then people started saying, well, let's call it new covenant theology because we embrace this idea of covenant, but we're not like the Presbyterians. And here's the big difference. This is the main thing. We don't hold that circumcision equals in the New Testament paedo-baptism. Baptizing of children. That became the big thing. And so to sort of make the distinction, people started saying before you
finish, I didn't mean to cut you off before you finish. Okay. So do you agree with Augustine's position in regards to paedo-baptism and linking it to original sin?
I forgot what he said. Didn't he say something like it can wipe it away or something? Didn't
Correct.
he say that
So
at some point?
he
Yeah, no.
yeah, he justifies paedo baptism because that was his stance to kind of be a proponent for paedo baptism. And the purpose of him actually making his dissertation about it is to kind of like give a way to justify it by means of original sin, right? And it was a way, like you said, that it kind of wipes away the sin of the infant and introduces them into the church, right? Because there's a concept that some people believe that children are born in sin or born sinners, and there's different ways how you can interpret that.
I do agree with that.
So you agree that children are born sinners?
Yes.
When they come out the womb?
Romans 5. That's why they die.
And I think that's interesting because we probably had to talk on another time. But I would, because I don't subscribe to that, right? I just want to let you know up front that my position is I don't subscribe to that. My take, just to sum it up, is that when children are born, children don't know, they don't have a conscience to know what's going on, right? So as children grow up, they're in an environment that is laden with sin, and that tends to shape their behavior, right? And that behavior that's being shaped is pretty much intertwined with their instincts, right? Because babies, when they're young, they operate off instincts, right? They don't have the cognitive understanding of the world around them. So the world around them, which is laden in sin, and you're exposed to sin all the time, it affects their instinctive nature to, over time, it becomes a developmental behavior, right? So that's what my position is. And what I will go over you another time, because this is not what I want to talk about today. I just wanted to get your take on it. Is exegeting Romans chapter 5, right? And is it really saying that when children are born, that they're born sinners, right? And what does that really mean? You know what I'm saying? And some people try to go back to Psalms 51, and that as well needs to be exegeted appropriately as well. So I just want to put on the table, that's my position. So if you ever want to have a discussion with me about
I'd be down with that. We would get into something called federal headship there.
Correct.
And so basically, this is not something that Americans or the modern mind generally likes. It's sort of an ancient way. I would actually say a more Hebraic way to view it, that the father represents his family and his descendants. And a perfect example would be, yes, Romans 5:12-14 in regards to Adam and all his offspring, but also even you see this shining through in the book of Hebrews 7:8-10. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And there's other places to go, but it has to do with federal headship, tying in with original sin. It's not simply, hey, look, the baby cried for too long or something like that.
So they committed a sin, right?
Right. It's the idea of being in Adam, and the reason why the baby sins is because the baby is a sinner.
But how can they be a sinner if they're not practicing the act of sin? Because
as sin came through one man, death spread to all men. That's literally what Romans 5:12 says. I mean, I understand you're saying you have a different way to look at it, but it says, just as through one man sin into the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men.
It says sin entered into the world because of an act that he committed. There's nothing in the text that speaks explicitly that Adam has passed sin down genetically, where when a child is born through his loins, which would be all mankind, that they are inheriting this sin nature, right? And this is why I had actual reference to Augustine, because he's the one really fleshed out original sin and used paedo baptism because he was actually dealing with the original sin and people that were against paedo baptism, right? So that was just kind of an apologetic work against it.
Well,
yeah, we can get into that when you get a time.
It gets into a parallel of the cross. And what I mean by that is because biblically, the work that Christ did on the cross, as well as him keeping the law perfectly in every way, the spirit and the letter, and really leading up to it, all of that, it's pure perfection. That, I believe, when you look at passages like 2 Corinthians 5:21, there's others, that righteousness is imputed to believers. So we have
but a baby can't believe though, right?
Right. No, they cannot. Yeah. We have a new federal head, though. And that's why the Bible says that
which is Christ, you're saying. So if you're saved, your
the Bible says you're in the first Adam or the last Adam, the first Adam.
Yeah, I'm saying, so if you're saying if you're saved, your children also were saved. So if you have a newborn tomorrow and your
Right.
newborn dies prematurely, then you're saying that through federal headship and because you receive Christ, then that is imputed onto your newborn. Is that what you're saying?
That's a good question. That's a different question, though. And that's a question Christians don't agree on, even Calvinists. So there's multiple ways to go with that, right? Some people just say, hey, look, all babies, because of they're sort of before the age of accountability, which may be a useful concept, but it's not a biblical concept. I'm not saying it's unbiblical. I'm just saying it's not laid out in scripture. You know, people are like, what age is it? Or what mental capacity? The Bible doesn't have that, although I could see why people might come to that kind of idea. The Bible itself doesn't really lay that out or say that. So some people say that. Others say, no, only the children of believers. Others say, and here's where it gets back to what I mentioned before in regards to Presbyterians and covenantalism. Others say, this is why we need to baptize our children. So they're included in the covenant prior to that. But then, you know, we come back and say, what exactly is happening? And so that's a different discussion. I don't think the Bible is crystal clear on what happens to children who die prior to that situation. I think you can take hints. For example, David said, he won't come to me, but I'll go to him. I find that to be a hint. It's difficult for me to say I'm going to lay down a solid doctrine based upon David saying that. There's some other places you got to be like children in order to XYG Jesus. To me, these are hints, but I try to say I'm not going to go hard in a place where and you know, that's hard on people because some people will be like, what do you mean? You can't just automatically say babies.
Postmodernists do that.
You know, but the big verse I would go to, though, in regards to that, really, though, in regards to like babies and Adam, is Romans 5:18. So then, as though one transgression, there resulted condemnation to all men. You know what I'm saying? So it is spread. And you see this in the Bible, and it's not easy for us to swallow. But like, you know, where the Israelites, one of them would sin and the whole family is condemned.
Like Achan.
That's a perfect example. Like that's exactly what I was going to bring up.
Correct.
And I'm not saying it's easy, but the beauty is on the flip side of the imputed work of Christ. And so that's the element of what I see in regards to Adam and being, you know, we're in Adam or we're in Christ.
Cool. So I appreciate that. And that was just like a sidebar, but I'm glad that you didn't shy away from it and you confronted it. Just sum up my initial point that I asked you. Can you please define for us replacement theology, supersessionism, and fulfillment theology? You don't have to look them up off the top of your head. And the reason why I say this is because this is extremely important because you dialogue with Israelites, you dialogue with Jews, you dialogue with Muslims, right? So in regards to this, a lot of our position is that the Most High did not replace Israel with the ecclesia of the church, right? That there's something else that is going on that can be explained outside of these terms, right? And again, you got to be careful because, like I said, some Christians don't like the word replacement. They say fulfillment theology. So that's why I asked, please define them, because my position is that a lot of Christians subscribe to supersessionism and they don't want to, admit that openly, right? So if you can define them for us so we can lay it on the table, I just want to get your position on that and then move on to my next point.
Well, all these are big terms. And it's difficult to be like, here's the definitive way.
No, but this is just from your off the dome right now, just so that people can understand and follow what we're saying. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, the way someone who doesn't agree, say with supersessionism, they would say something like, the people of the new covenant have replaced the people of the old covenant.
That they no longer are relevant. They no longer are in existence in regards to covenant with the Most High, etc.
Right. And so the thing is, though, you know, it's like this. Nobody likes to be, and I get this, and this may lead us in other directions. You may say, oh, ironic. But no one likes to necessarily be labeled by their detractors, right? Mm-hmm. And so detractors are the ones generally who you find using supersessionism and especially replacement theology. And that's okay if they're describing the same reality. However, sometimes what I notice, sometimes the disagreement begins in the very beginning with the definition itself. Mm-hmm. And replacement theology, I don't know if there's really much difference people make when they say replacement theology with supersessionism. If there's a subtle difference, I'm not necessarily aware of it.
I have an article I can send to you from seminary professor who, this is what his mastery is in. I'll send it to you when we finish. He wrote a great article on it that helps to outline that. And the main reason why I bring it up is because when you deal with Israelites, and I don't know if maybe you've, I guess, sensed it, but that's really what you're fighting with them with, right? In their mind, your theology is replacing Israel, right? So a lot of times if it's not laid out, like these terms are not laid out and things are properly categorized, then this is going to be a point of contention that'll be extremely difficult to get over that hill, right? So that's why I'm asking you to lay it out now, so it's open and clear. So now when they approach you and you have a discussion, they understand the minute details that's causing that contention, right?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. That's a whole, there's tons of conversations on that. Hold on, let me temporarily hide. Just until I'm done talking to Ron and Rachel, let me put you on the hold. You're here, but I'm just not gonna have your picture on the screen. Like, for example, the Master's Seminary, started out of John MacArthur's ministry there, Grace in California, yada, yada, yada. They are Reformed, they are Calvinists, but they also ascribe to a version of dispensationalism and fight against what they do call replacement or supersessionist theology. And, there's an article you can find online pretty easily if anyone's interested in this, from the Master's Seminary Journal called Various Forms of Replacement Theology, right?
That's the article I was referring
to. So there's an example of one that you can look at, right? And they're interesting because most people who are Reformed are not them. So for a long time, when I first became Reformed, I held to that same view, but over time, I really came to see that I don't think this is really what the New Testament is saying and how it views these promises. So whatever term people use is not as a big a deal as long as they sort of get the idea right. The idea is that there's promises given by God to people in the Old Testament, and it begins before there is a nation of Israel. Now, I know you know this. I'm just saying this to the audience. There's not a nation of Israel, and yet God is giving promises all the way back in Genesis 3, and in regards to things that he is going to do that are going to happen in time. Now, he begins to work specifically through certain people. Noah is the best example. Out of that, and so, we go from Adam to Noah. So really everybody's descendants of Noah, those 8, all right? That family is what I mean, Noah's family. Now you have everybody on the earth and you have promises made there. And eventually you get Abraham, and Abraham is called out. So what's different about Abraham, right? Mainly that he's chosen by God. That's the big difference, is God's disposition towards him. The chosenness of Abraham is sort of what's special about Abraham. Now, we can talk about his faith and this and that, but ultimately, this is God working this out. He makes covenants, but these are really unilateral covenants in a lot of ways. I don't think sometimes people really appreciate the sort of unilateral nature of a lot of the covenants that God makes. Meaning, he's saying, here's what I'm going to do.
One way.
Here's what it is, right? We're going to, and he cuts the covenant himself. It's kind of a wild picture of what happens with God, cuts through the carcass and all this kind of stuff. When you read it, it's like, whoa, and there's birds and all kinds of stuff going on. So you look at that and then you say, okay, how does this work out? And the promise is to bless all the families of the nation. And that's where a big debate comes in, right? And then it's worked out. And in a lot of, I think, Jews of Jesus's and Paul and the apostles' day might have said similar things about, hey, what are you guys doing here? What exactly is happening? Because I think they were looking at key Old Testament passages differently than some of their contemporaries. And I think that was part of the disagreement, especially as it related to Gentiles. Because the question is, who are these promises really for? What's going on here? And so Christians disagree with that. Now, of course, Hebrew Israelites and some Christians will disagree with that on principle, because there's some Christians who would be dispensational that have a lot of similarities there with people who would still see a central place for Israel in a way that a covenant theologian wouldn't. And so I'm okay with whatever term it's being called, but that's where what I call progressive covenantalism comes in.
Right.
That's the term. And it's that same idea. Everything fulfilled through that funnel of Christ, right? And what does that mean for the way God's people look now? And all I'm saying is we never take away from the historical pedgree or reality to ethnic national Israel, right?
Oh,
we don't
say that loud.
I don't take away from that. But if whoever was here, whether it was a Hebrew Israelite or a dispensationalist, we would be having a very similar discussion about what that means now and really what that means since Christ came. And that's really where the discussion is. And people can, say whatever, like, oh, you do it because of this reason or that reason. The question is, to me, what does the text say, right? And that's why I get people wanted to say, what about the Jews over there, the Jews over here? Who is an ethnic Jew is of minor consequence, I believe, in the year 2020 and the years before that. I'm saying? Not just this year, but before that, because of the Bible's view on it. So that's a perspective. anyone who doesn't agree with that, I get it. We can discuss it, but that's why I don't sweat it as much. Now I have to sometimes get into it because certain people that I discuss with, they want to make that a big deal. But
so are all Old Testament prophecies, are they all fulfilled through the church? Meaning that does anything relate to ethnic Israel outside the church as far as Old Testament prophecies?
say it one more time. Does
Sure.
anything relate
So
to
I'm
ethnic
saying,
Israel
so are there
outside?
any prophecies that relate to ethnic Israel outside of the New Testament church?
So going forward, you're saying, okay.
No, I'm just saying, just generally speaking, like from your position, do you believe that all the prophecies are going to be fulfilled through the church, or that there's still some Old Testament prophecies that are fulfilled by ethnic Israel, whether they're in the church or outside the church?
Right. Well, the short answer is through it's the church. But the longer answer, I would say, if I was going to be more precise, I would say something like Christ working through his people. And here's what I mean. For example, I do believe that Romans 11 teaches what looks like to be some kind of end times massive coming in of ethnic Israelites into the covenant promises that they've essentially been estranged from or blinded from, according to, I think, what the Bible is saying, which the Old Testament actually, I believe, predicts. They predict sort of like, I think that's actually some of the prophecy of through people with stammering, lips, tongues, I'll teach these people.
Correct.
Like, I think it actually has to do with sort of the judgment of almost the foreigners in the covenant as sort of a way to, what the Bible says, make Israel jealous, right? But I do think there'll be a time when then God sovereignly chooses that through the working of the new covenant people, and that's Jew and Gentile alike. Yes, it's mainly Gentile right now. I recognize that reality, but it's not only, and so I don't discount the fact of a multicultural, multi-ethnic, diversified, including those who in some way could trace their lineage back to Israel in some way, right? And so God working through them, though, to see a massive end times a conversion of many people who in some way would be recognized as ethnic Israel. I do think that Romans 11 says that. So there's that reality, but see, even that is the Trinitarian God, and I know we don't agree there, but the triune God working through his people to have that happen. Now it's according to God's timing. It's when he wants it to be, all that kind of stuff, but it is through the working of his people who, again, are a multi-ethnic, multilingual, et cetera, group of people, right? And so that's reality. But the question is then what's happening? They're being sort of, Christ is that vine. See, in the Old Testament, Israel is pictured at that vine. Jesus totally supplants, some pun intended there, supplants that, and that he makes himself the vine. You know what I'm saying? And by the way, that's a good proof that Jesus is divine. Sorry, bad joke. It's a corny joke, bro. But he's divine, and now he says, "You're my branches." Who? Those are his disciples. It's not being attached to Israel. It's being attached to Jesus Christ.
So let me ask you a question. So when you read scriptures like Zechariah, last verse where it says that the Feast of Tabernacles is going to be restored in the end times, and you read like Isaiah 66 where it talks about the Levites being restored in end times and that the law is going to go out, what is your take on that?
Well, okay, let's go to Zechariah first. Zechariah where? Yeah,
let me bring it up for you. Zechariah, I should know this by heart, but I typically get it mixed up with another one. Should be the last chapter in Zechariah, verse 14. And chapter 14, I'm sorry, and it's going to be verse 18. And if you can start at 16 for context.
All right, guys, the time here. It's going to take a second.
Sure, take your time.
Okay, Zechariah 14. Where did you say? I'm sorry.
Zechariah 14. You can start at 16 for context, but the verse in question is verse 18.
All right, Zechariah 14, starting at verse 16, you said?
Yeah, for context.
Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. The family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves. There on them shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the feast of booths.
Verse 19 too.
This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to the feast.
All right. So what's your take on that? When is that happening?
Well, let's see here.
From your position, is that when Christ comes back? Is that going to happen at some end time event before he comes back? Because if you read up in earlier verse, like start at verse 1 and on, you'll see that there's some return of Yod-Heh-Wav-Heh, Yahweh in there that makes a reference to him returning back as king, right? And that's when you get the verse where it says, Yah will go out to fight, verse 3, against the nations. As he fights the day of battle, on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mountain of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley. So this is going to be a battle that's going to happen. And once the nations are subdued and the king is put on the throne, there's going to be a situation where there's a beckoning call for all the nations in Egypt to come and keep the feast of Sukkot or tabernacles, right? So I just want to, so that's why I was asking you, certain questions in regards to, do you believe that there's any prophecies that relate solely to ethnic Israel, whether they're in the church or outside the church? Because Zechariah 14 in regards to the Feast of Tabernacles, and then going to Isaiah 66, we see the restoration of the Levites, right? And the law going out in the end time. So I'm just trying to figure out in your timeline, where does that fit? Where are these events happening? Right, especially with your position of covenantal, progressive covenantalism, and dealing with the covenants. The last events that are happening, why is there a restoration of the Levites and a restoration of tabernacles if these things really are not going to matter at this point in time, if they've been superseded by the New Testament church?
Right. All right. Well, whenever I have these kind of Old Testament passages, to me, it's always a work in progress. What I mean by that is, you have interpretation, you go back to the text, sometimes you revise your interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. But here's where we're at with that now. Egypt, is this nation that in a lot of ways is an arch enemy. There's a few nations that are sometimes written sort of arch enemies of Israel in the Old Covenant, right? Not every nation is mentioned all the time. Egypt is mentioned a lot. Babylon is mentioned a lot. Of course, Edom is mentioned a lot, et cetera, et cetera. Egypt is, of course, who Israel came out of. They had to be delivered out of this nation to even start their existence as a people. And so because of that, it is true, I see a lot of times in scripture that Egypt stands as an example of those who are ultimately against God. So some people see this as Egypt being singled out. I see it sort of almost like the way we talked about federal headship, meaning that Egypt is an example of the kind of nation who stood against God, because it seems odd to only be Egypt, for example. What about everybody else? Now, it's expected here from this prophecy that they're going to come and worship the Lord. Now, ultimately, I see this as a positive prophecy, and here's why. Because people who in many ways, the Egyptians here, and them being representative of these other nations, were excluded in a lot of ways from really being part of the covenant people. Now they're expected to be worshiping the Lord and being part of the covenant people. And that's what the next verses lay out, basically. And so what are they doing here? They're engaging in something that previously only those who were faithful Israelites would do, going up to Jerusalem, worshiping the king. Now, I see that when I look over to the New Testament as explicitly at the end of the day, meaning Jesus. And I'll give you the best place I would look, and this even is a quotation of an Old Testament passage. It's Philippians 2:10, which of course Philippians 2:10 itself comes out of Isaiah 45. I forget which verse off the top of my head. I could look that up too. But this is actually in regards to Yahweh, and yet Paul makes it about Yeshua, so that at the name of Jesus, Yeshua, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and on earth. That originally, in its original context of Isaiah 45, was to Yahweh. Now, I'm not saying there's a distinction, because Yahweh is not strictly the Father. Yahweh is triune, I understand. And so here you have a situation where you see explicitly laid out Jesus as as a member of the triune Godhead, is receiving worship that only God should receive. Unless he's God, then it doesn't make sense. So here he is receiving worship, Philippians 2:10. So Egypt is his representative nation that's going to have that happen. So they have an opportunity now that they join in this feast of Yahweh. And this is a realization that God is supernaturally giving to Zechariah, that those who are, generally speaking, outside of the covenant promises, now Zechariah anticipates that they will be inside of the covenant promises, also receiving covenant blessings. And this has to do with Israel being a light to the nations. It's actually getting fulfilled here. And that starts again, which I mentioned earlier, all the way back to the Abrahamic call and the Abraham covenant, Genesis 12. And of course, Isaiah 49:6 as well. Is it too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, to bring back the preserved of Israel? I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. And so now they're not hostile. They're not enemies. There's a reversal in that final day in which you see universal worship of Christ. So all that being said with this, I would end up viewing a lot of this as the big picture is you're going to have people from all over worshiping Jesus. That's the big picture. Now, specifically, are they traveling to Jerusalem to take place to take part in the specific feast? To me, I'm not as sure that that's literally exactly what's happening. I'm okay with the big picture and then asking, okay, does this literally mean this, or is this something that we understand is representative of this? That to me is okay either way. Meaning, if someone wants to make a case that this is literally they're going to do that, okay. And I think you see the beginning of that in Acts chapter 2. Because it says there's people from here, from there, and proselytes, right? So the proselytes would also be from all these places, and they're there, and they hear the beginning of that promise. Now, that hasn't been completed, right? But you see the beginning of that. And so I do think there's some questions I would ask. Now, my dispensational brothers would not ask this, about how what is literal in regards to how Jewish, and I know people don't all like that word, but how Jewish of a character the final kingdom will be. And then if this is a situation where you could have this, for example, you could have this being occurred in a more harsh, literal way, perhaps during the millennium. So I'm historical, meaning I still hold the millennium.
Okay. And
that's a possibility.
I want to stop you there. Because I wanted, that's why I said your timeline, right? I wanted to see so you are millennials, right? Are you a post or pre-millennials?
Historic premillennial. Yeah, I do not believe there's a secret rapture.
All right, perfect.
I think it's an unbiblical, not a heretical, but an unbiblical doctrine.
Correct. Okay. So, and you made a good point, so there's a juxtaposition between Israel and Egypt, right? Because of what they've experienced with Egypt, even though Egypt was used on several instances to protect Israel and save Israel, right? When they were being attacked from the enemies on the east. But then also you have different authors like in Isaiah 19:25, where the Most High says, Israel, my people, right? And Israel is my inheritance, right? So you don't really see a one black and white position where the Most High is against Egypt. But there are some elements of Egypt that represents that juxtaposition between him calling out the Israel as a base people and Israel being a great opulent nation. You know what I'm saying? But my position is that this is going to be a restoration of the things of the Old Testament in the end times if we hold to these prophecies in the Old Testament. That's why I was saying, like, is the New Testament church fulfilling all of these things, or some of these things still apply directly to Israel themselves, right? Because this is when Israel's about to be sieged again, and that's when you're going to have a supernatural intervention. And at the intervention has been completed, now you have an establishment. So people will jump into Revelation chapter 19 and say, hey, that explains it right there. When the millennium period is ushered in, Christ is on the seat, and he's the one that's fulfilling this. So I mean, whether somebody agrees that that's Yeshua or somebody else, that's neither here nor there to me, because either way, it's whatever. I'm just seeing if the New Testament is replacing the Old Testament prophecies in the Old Testament as God's people, then I just want to see if things like this is still relevant, right? And the last place I'll take you is just Isaiah 66, right? Because Isaiah 66 goes into that a little bit more about the restoration of the Levites. So what is your position on restoration of the Levites in the end times? Why would there be a need of restoration of the Levites if they've been replaced by the New Testament church? If there's a order of Melchizedek, if somebody subscribes to it as a new priesthood or something like that, why is there a restoration of the Levites? So Isaiah 66, I'll bring you there. Isaiah 66, and you're going to jump down for context. You can start at verse 19, but the verse in context that I'm talking about is verse 21, right? Why is there priests and Levites being selected from the Israelites in the end time when they're being replaced by the New Testament church? Is this now irrelevant? Is this like one of those valleys that's not being seen by the prophets, and then now the New Testament reveals something different that supersedes this? Like, what is your position on this? Do you believe that this is still going to occur, or do you believe that this is something that has been replaced by something in the New Testament?
All right. So Isaiah 66:20. All right.
Mm-hmm. And I will bring all your brothers from all the nations as a gift to Yod-Heh-Wav on horses and chariots and wagons and mules and camels to my holy mountain Jerusalem. Remember, we refer to Jerusalem in Zechariah as well. Says Yod-Heh-Wav, just as the Israelites bring an offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Most High, and I will select some of them as priests and Levites, says Yah. And then it says, for just as the new heavens and the new earth, which I shall make will endure before me, so your descendants and your name will endure. Now, some people say, well, that can occur through the New Testament covenant, right? Through Christ. But why is there a selection of priests and Levites? Like, what would be the need of that during this end time if the New Testament church has already replaced the need for Levitical priesthood?
Well, there's some versions of a millennialist view that have a timeline, something like this. Here's the Lord's coming. But then, because there's people who are on the earth when the Lord comes back, who never submitted to his rule, they just happen to survive, in essence, there's still a further evangelization of the world. And they have in that schema too. And so I could go, so I do believe in the millennium. So this is a possible way to look at it. A full return of Israel, Jerusalem during that 1,000 years is sort of established as a place of pilgrimage, essentially the world's capital, right? There's a view of that. And I used to be much more strong on that. I'm not as sure about that now. Another way to look at it is this is sort of in between the first and second comings of Christ. And so verse 18 shows the purpose, and the verses 19 to 21 would be it happening. And so that sign there actually would be the sign of Christ crucified and risen. And I would go to Matthew 12:38 through 40 for that, the sign of Jonah. And so the remnant then is sent out to the nations, verse 19, and they gather his people into Jerusalem. Now, on that view, Jerusalem is not the literal city. It's essentially a way to describe, in Old Testament terms, the states of final glory or perdition. And there's some evidence for that too. Galatians 4:25 through 26, which says that Jerusalem above is free and she is our mother, specifically verse 26, but where it's not really about this present physical, temporal, geographical Jerusalem. So within that, you have verse 21 being either worshipers who are within God's people, or these are Gentiles who are basically being admitted full membership as they are Jews, meaning some of them are in essence Levites. So that's another way to see it. So I don't see it as a reestablishment of a Levitical priesthood, because Christ.
You don't see that. Okay.
No, not in any kind of literal way. No matter what. I could see someone making some cases from the millennium for that. But if they did that, there would be essentially a comma in God's plan, because the millennium is an 1,000-year event. And so, okay, I could see that. But there needs to be discussion about that. But Christ is a final priest. He's a final priest. He sat down. His work is completed. And the Bible even says, look, he's not of Aaron. So how is that? And then this is in Hebrews, of course, there's clearly been some kind of alteration. There's an alteration. Now, what are we going to do about that? And the author of Hebrews makes an argument like that's not really the only thing. There's changes. The new covenant is different, because you could make the case, well, Jesus doesn't really qualify. He's not a descendant of Aaron. What are you talking about? Doing the work of a priest. What are you talking about? Sitting down.
Well, that's resolved earlier in Zechariah when the two positions are going to be one, right? You have the throne of the king and you have the priesthood position, and the two will be one. right? So you can also argue that because he was inducted into the order of Melchizedek, or he's the high priest of the order of Melchizedek, according to the Hebrew book of Hebrews, that is his priesthood right there, which is greater than the Levitical priesthood and takes place after the Israelites are dispersed, right? So he still fulfills a priesthood role and a kingship role, right, through the loins of David. So he can do both. Right. So it depends. I guess it just depends on your angle and how you view it. But I just wanted to know, like, why is there mention of Levites in the end times? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
If there should be no need, why it says your brothers as a gift I will bring from the other nations, and from them, those Israelites, I will select priests and Levites.
Oh, well, okay.
Right?
So then I might see another disagreement there, because you said from them your brothers. But let me show, because let me show you what we've got here.
Sure.
Verse 20, they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations.
Correct. So the Israelites were scattered through all the nations. So, of course, they're going to bring their brothers from there. Just like when we look in Isaiah chapter 11, after the scattering, the Israelites will be drawn from all nations, because that's where they've been scattered to, four corners of the earth. So their brothers are going to be amongst them, just like you saw in Acts chapter 2, where all the Israelites from the different parts of the world and proselytes. This is all of them are going to be brought into the end time to Jerusalem for these things to be fulfilled. Right.
Yeah. So I could see
sure.
how I could see how someone maybe during Isaiah's day might strictly see that, but I don't think that's a faithful. I don't think that's a faithful New Covenant interpretation. The brothers from all the nations are brothers from all nations, and here's an interesting reason why I partially say that. The end of verse 20 says, "Just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord." So wait, why is it saying just as the Israelites?
Because when it says there, wait, I got you. So
do you see what I'm saying by that argument, though? I don't know if everyone.
It's all answered in the same verse, right? So when he's saying, "I'm gonna bring all your brothers from all nations as a gift," those who have not been polluted with the ways of those nations that they're in, the ones that are actually the remnant that's keeping and holding fast to the covenant, when he brings them back to Jerusalem, it's the same way as you bring in a clean gift into the house of the Most High. That's what he accepts. So he's saying here as that gift, because that same word gift is used also for an offering. I'm bringing this gift, just like you bring a gift into my house, I'm bringing your brothers as a gift. This is what he's saying, as a gift, and they're being presented. And from them, this is why they can be selected as priests and Levites, because of their whole steadfastness while they were dispersed, right? They've kept the covenant, they've been diligent. And then from those, he's going to bring back. And then out of those, he's going to make priests and Levites, because same way that you would take your offering and bring it into the house so it could be accepted by the Most High. And there's different types of offerings depending upon why you're bringing it. This is what the Most High is saying that he's doing as well. He's going to perform as well. So I don't see anywhere that this is referring to those brothers or Israelites being Gentiles as well. But what I would say is that if you see this as a mountain peak in the valley, is that, okay, during this time, Gentiles are being brought in. So now when we get to this point in time, now those can also be those proselytes we see in Acts chapter 2. Right. But I think if somebody was looking at this, if you look at somebody who was Jewish and they was reading this, they would never say that these were Gentiles. Right. They would say these are bloodline Israelites.
Well, I mean, that may be true depending on where they lived and what their understanding was, because I see a variant of this very symbolism of what I mentioned in Romans 15, verses 15 through 16. Here's what it reads. "On some points I have written to you very boldly by way of reminder, because of the grace given me by God to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles, in the priestly service of the gospel of God, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit." To me, that seems like a clear allusion back to Isaiah 66:21. I mean, I don't know what else Paul would mean by that. To me, it seems like that's exactly what he has in mind. Now, sometimes the Bible is more on the nose, just as Micah prophesied, and other times these are allusions and things embedded in the text. But Paul doesn't draw his language in a vacuum, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. When you say on the nose, when you say Micah You say that point about Micah again.
Yeah, I'm saying sometimes, it'll be like, just as the prophet Isaiah said, Matthew might say that, or, they'll mention a specific thing, just as Jeremiah wrote. I was getting Micah
Okay,
as
because
an
you mentioned
example.
Micah. Okay, because I was going to ask you about Micah 4 and 2, and because all of this is related, right? As far as the end times and all the prophecy we feel through the church, because the law is going to go back out in the last days, right? So again, when we look at the Levites, when we look at the law going out, and when we look at the previous verses that I gave you, it all looks like there's a restoration of the Old Testament Israelites in regards to things that need to be fulfilled in the end time.
Well,
Right?
back one more thing with Isaiah, Ron,
Sure.
and what you're saying as far as tonight, these specific verses, there are plenty of Christians, so I recognize this, and this is okay, who would be 100% rocking with you right now of the dispensational variety, and I don't think could disagree with literally anything you said in regards to those passages. I get that. I respect that. I'm willing to be wrong about these, but at the same time, I'll give answers for why I don't think that's the case. And when I look at Isaiah 66, not only taking into consideration what was said in Romans 15 as to give a further understanding about what this means, you also have the situation that it's interesting. It's like the clean vessel is sort of representative of Israel, but this grain offering to me is representative of those Gentiles from other nations. And out of them, there will be worshipers. Basically, that's the way I see it. That is a new covenant exegesis of it. And I understand some people aren't going to rock with that or roll with that. But to me, that's a further way, a better way to look at it. And also, it just goes with what Paul was saying in Romans 15 through 16. It's a variant of that very symbolism. You know what I'm saying? And so that's why I try to mention a couple passages, like in regards to Jerusalem and different things like that. And what do we do about, is there really a reestablishment of the Levitical priesthood when, we already have a high priest once for all? If the high priest is done, we don't need all these little, lower priests, the high
and that's
priest.
why I was, and again, that's along the lines of what I was asking you to see what your position was, but you answered it pretty thoroughly.
Let me, maybe if you got one more thing, Ron, I got Rachel.
Yeah, just one more
She's
point.
been on hold for a while. And then she'll probably be our last person for tonight, but go ahead.
No problem. And she was saying this was a exciting conversation. That's what she said in the chat. I don't know if you see in the chat.
Oh, no, I wasn't able to see.
Yeah, she said this is totally exciting conversation. So, Rachel, we apologize for keeping you on hold. I normally don't get time with vocab like this. So since he opened up the invitation for Smoke, I decided to ask him a couple of questions. It's kind of narrowed down. So yeah, I'll get my last point in, and I'll be out your way until maybe a future time when you have this session.
I'm all good with that. It's always a pleasure, and I mean that.
No problem. I appreciate that. So my last point, because I couldn't make the other points I wanted to make, but my last point is, with the recent occurrences of injustice that's happening in society, are you a proponent of protesting?
I took part in a protest here in Phoenix.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Now, I didn't have the megaphone.
Did you riot?
No, I didn't riot. So when I saw it, there wasn't any of that. Well, okay. So there's 2 to 3 times I was involved in different ways. And one of the times, and I put a little video, just showed some footage while I was there, nothing sort of epic, but I forget what it's called. It's called, Inside My View of the Phoenix Protest or something like that. It's like 6 minutes. But it's nothing like, I have friends like my friend down here, Warren Stewart Jr., that I've rolled with for a long time. We did the one together and some other things. He had the megaphone, he's doing a whole nother level. It wasn't like that. I mean, I live very, very, very close to where all this stuff happens in downtown Phoenix. And so I literally, one time walked down there, another time rode a bike down there. So I was there within 3 minutes. Right. And so, it was sort of a mixture of, hey, look what's going on, and let's see what's going on firsthand, right? I wanted to really know for myself. And so these kinds of things are tricky because whenever you have a whole bunch of people like that, how do you co-sign everything everyone is saying? So I co-sign we need police reform. I co-sign we need to stand up for the unjust death of George Floyd. And he's not the only one. We had actually some local situations here in Phoenix that were involved because it was local to us. A young man by the last name of Washington. That wasn't a national thing as much, but that was important to us here in Phoenix. You know, he was involved as well. So it's not just Floyd is obviously sort of the spark in this situation, but there's other things, that injustice. So I co-signed that and believed in working for it. Right. I co-sign like what I mean, real change in policy, because we can't fix everyone's heart, but we can certainly make policies that incentivize or disincentivize bad behavior on the part of police specifically.
Mhm.
We could do that. And, you know, we can't afford to just be like, well, you know, there's a bad look, change policy. And either racist and bad actors in general, they get driven out, or there's so much policy surrounding them and they're so worried about their own well-being that they basically have to act right.
Leave. Yeah.
Because we can't fix everyone's heart, but we can do things that incentivize or disincentivize these behaviors. And it comes with a number of real things. For example, it's no longer an excuse to say, well, the body camera was off on this point. There's been times it happened. And the reason why that's important is because we have case after case of where a cop says, here's what happened. And then we watch the footage and that is not what happened. And a lot of people that have dealt with cops have had that exact thing where they lied about what happened. I mean, if it was just one of us, then it'd be like, okay. When I say one person, but it's like, you see it and there it is and it happens. So like, what are we supposed to do? Like, no, it has, and there has to be severe repercussions when there's not recorded for some reason. Right. Okay. That's one thing. I think it should, and I'm generally for tort reform, meaning I think it should be more difficult to sue people. I think America's sue crazy in a lot of ways, and people find a way to just get money, and anybody can sue you for anything. I think that's bad, except I think it should be easier to sue cops.
Yeah, but see, and that's why the Justice
have them be
and
personally
Policing
liable.
Act. Yeah, that's why the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 has been put forth by the House. For the Republicans in the Senate to actually pass, because what it would do is get rid of what's called qualified immunity, and that's a big one. That exempts those police officers when they're acting in their role as a police officer from being personally sued for an incident like that to occur, right? They can be fired and discharged, but normally the suit goes against the state or the city or the town, right? So I commend you for saying that you went to a protest, for acknowledging these injustices, because I've spoken to other Christian apologists that has the same ethnic background as you, and they're like, well, it doesn't matter in the scheme of things, right? Just get your soul saved, right? That's their main thing. Like, they don't even care about what's going on socially. And I just wanted to see if you were more socially sensitive and responsible in regards to your stance when injustice is playing out, because a lot of times, you know, some people would just wholeheartedly so much to the gospel where they neglect other things that you're commanded to do, right, and act righteously. So I'm glad you said that. And just two follow-up points.
That's a both and, right? You know what I'm saying? I agree with what you're saying there. I don't agree with everything they do, but there is a good thing happening. And someone that I respect is involved heavily, Show Baraka, with something called the AND campaign. And that's that very idea, you know, of not just one thing, but it is tricky, meaning I can chant along, and I did, no justice, no peace. And by that, I don't mean rioting. I mean, see, that's the problem, is I'm saying it and I mean something. There might be a guy next to me who means like, nah, we're going to go target people and go get them. Up. So it is difficult. But the thing is, every mass movement is like that in history. That's kind of like, you kind of understand, like, that's not that it's good, but it's like the civil rights movement had their missteps. There were times where, you know, like, King wasn't always able to perfectly have everything be how he wanted. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's a mass movement towards the right thing, and justice can happen. And so I recognize that. But I can't chant with the crowd, because there was some of this, too, of F the police. Now, I get anti-police sentiment, but I'm not going to chant along with that. I'm not going to
NWO.
I'm not going to go flip off cops. And it's crazy, you know.
That's extreme. That's really extreme.
Yeah. But there does need to be real change. And it's, you never want to say it's hopeless or it's going to get worse, but I have some concerns and worries too. But I do think there could be some positive things that come out of ultimately a negative moment. But I realize it's a succession, lots of moments, but what kind of sparked things off. But, and again, Go ahead. I'll stop right there.
And I asked you that just to wrap up so I can go. This case, somebody's going. But I asked you that because I want to know what you felt personally, and I'm linking it to your theological disposition, right? And two things that I want to end off with is, number one, do you see any of this as any prophecy in the text, right? And number two, how do you reconcile your position of protesting and speaking against this with certain, I would say, views of Calvinism?
Right.
Like certain views of Calvinism say, well, this is meant to happen, right? So why would you interfere or do anything? And just for a reference, check out what they're doing in Minneapolis. The city council ruled to disband the police department and create a community-led model. So they actually are enacting change where they actually got rid, or in the process of getting rid of, the police department itself. Right. So you can go check that out. Yeah. And I have a friend that lives up there who gets involved in activism, and they're like kind of convinced that, yeah, they're serious about this, and they're making steps now to select, social activists and other people with experience in the community to actually lead this new model. So that's hope.
To me, police reform is different than defunding the police, because what happens
it's not defunding at all. It's disbanding.
No,
so
but that's been
totally different.
But people have been talking about those tracks of action as well. And what happens is, if you do that, you end up with some organization that looks just like the cops, but it's not
and
called
makes
the
it
cops.
Worse. Correct.
And so that's why I think civilian oversight is important. Even the military is supposed to have civilian oversight at the end of the day. But where's the real civilian oversight with the police? It doesn't. It seems like we have more civilian oversight of the military in some ways
than we do the police.
That's crazy. And that makes no sense to me. Yeah. But the disbandment would come if a person thinks that people can, in essence, kind of like be good. And like that's not a need to have the government, who ultimately at the end of the day, in aligned with Romans and other passages, does bear the sword and doesn't bear it in vain. So I'm not about disbanding. I do think cops need to get demilitarized, but that's different than defunding. Correct. And some of those other things. Because I see people, that's the tough thing. You advocate for one thing and then someone's like, but it's similar with abolition. If anyone studies the history of abolition in the United States, there was various interpretations, and even Douglas had disagreements with some of his fellow abolitionists, where some would say, well, if the Bible really is pro-slavery, get rid of the Bible or get rid of the Constitution, depending on who he was talking with. And Douglas said, no, keep both and understand their meaning. And so we kind of always got to deal with this, right? I think. Now, do I see it as prophecy?
That's some prophecy.
Nation against nation. Maybe the prophecy, nation against nation.
Explain that. What do you mean nation against nation?
There is a way to understand nation as ethnic groups within a geographical boundary.
Interesting.
I think that's a possible legitimate thing of the unrest of the end before Christ returns. You could have some of these things being, but it's not just in America. That's a thing though. We have what we going on. But look at Syria or some other places we can mention that it's like, dear Lord, and I know a lot of I know a good amount of refugees because of being here in Phoenix, and
the
a
church
good amount
that
come through.
You go to has the Syrians.
So I could see nation against nation. That is an aspect, because I don't think it always has to mean United States versus Russia, for example.
Correct.
I think that might be a limited meaning of what it means. So that's a potential one. But, police brutality has always been real. John the Baptist had to tell those Roman soldiers, hey, don't be doing this and that to the people you're over. Treat them right.
And Paul also had to speak about his persecution at the hands of his people and saying, I'm a Roman citizen. Why are you doing me dirty like this? You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So there's always an appeal to righteous citizenship, right? Or civic duties that you are carrying out, and the freedoms you're giving, like in Rome, to speak your mind about certain things, right? To have that dialogue, because that was like that Grecian element where they will always talk about philosophies and different things like that.
They claimed wanted to be just.
Correct.
The Romans, and I feel like things are more complicated than people let on. The Romans are the evil, wicked. The Romans were more fair than the Babylonians. I mean, and there's plenty to say about Rome and its excess.
And the Assyrians too.
Yeah, and you could say, during the days of Nero and Caligula, okay. But they at least gave lip service, hey, there's this God of justice and there's these issues. And they viewed themselves as like carrying on the model of the Greeks who were supposed to be enlightened. And it's almost like they're enlightened warriors. And you see it in Marcus Aurelius, who thought he was a philosopher emperor. Now, whether that's true or not, but you can at least appeal to that sense hypothetically. And if you read Luke, it's interesting, and read Acts, Luke presents the Romans a lot of times as protectors of the Christians against mob elements. A lot of times it's the mob who's trying to lynch or get the Christians. And a lot of times you'll see the Romans, who really a lot of times have no clue what's going on. They're like, there's some matters of their law. They actually a lot of times will actually protect them so they're not killed. They're just like, basically, why are you causing trouble? Stop causing trouble. We don't know what you Jews are arguing about. Stop causing trouble, but we'll at least try to not let you get killed unfairly. And it's a very interesting thing. Not that Luke's an apologist for Rome. I'm not saying that, but they're presented in more sort of neutral or objective light than sometimes people look at, which is a fascinating thing. So maybe some of the prophecies in relationship to nation against nation would be at least one, but also probably against sort of wicked governments, and all that. Those kinds of things I think could be a possibility as well.
You believe America is a wicked government?
Well, I believe all governments, because all people are wicked. They're all wicked. And so
that's kind of like general, right? Like, well,
it is, yes, but it's almost like America is the worst except for everybody else. Like, and I would say that tongue in cheek. It's a variation of people. So what I mean is, of course, yes. I mean, you can look at stuff now, but all you got to do is look at if someone doesn't believe that, like there's people alive still today, ladies and gentlemen, who were alive when little girls were getting blown up in churches, and firemen are turning their hoses on people, and dogs were used as attack beasts against grown men and women, and the list goes on and be
careful, Vocab. Patriots don't come at you. You have a lot of patriots that are gonna get say you say America is wicked. They're not gonna like that, Vocab.
But like everyone else, I mean, we can't hold up the mirror to everybody else and not hold up the mirror to ourselves.
No, I feel you.
And those things are very real. Whole police departments being in cahoots with the KKK.
Thing, because we'll keep. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to get off that way. So the last thing was, I just want you to explain your Calvinistic view in harmony with what you just said, right? Because there's some Calvinists will say, well, that's the will of the Most High, it's predestined, that's the way it's supposed to be. We shouldn't get involved. We should just let it play out, right? The way it needs to play. And they stand on the sidelines. Why do you say, well, I'm going to protest and I'm going to speak against injustice? What makes your position distinct from your other Calvinist brethren that would say, well, this has nothing to do with us, right?
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
I do think probably my Calvinism, for lack of a better word, tempers my views about some of those things. And here's what I mean by that. I recognize that this place is not our true home. And I recognize that any justice we enact here is approximate and temporal. And so what I mean by that is, if I had a view of the world, and this is not necessarily a Calvinism Arminian debate, it's more of a Christian versus, say, atheistic or materialistic debate. If I had a view of the world, this is our one shot, this is all we got, there's nothing else after that, there's no echoes in eternity, as was said in one movie, and that's that, then I think it sort of becomes all the more it's like, this is all it is. So any justice we get, we got to do it now because there's no further justice. So I think there's an element of it being tempered, but being Calvinist and believing in social reform, to me, I don't view it as odds with each other. And I mean, some people that want to have nothing to say about social issues need to remember the Reformation. The Reformation was a theological movement that affected everything wherever it touched, and led to all kinds of changes in regards to political rule, in regards to how a people of a given municipality were able to determine what kind of government they had and what kind of religious options were on the table, so to speak. It opened up the door eventually. It was definitely a heave-ho process, opened up the door eventually, though, for greater religious freedom to an extent. We got to remember, religious freedom has not been the order of the day in the world. And so it was real struggle to get there. The Reformation, though, to me, is what opened up the door for a lot of that. The Reformation eliminated the hard line that Rome had drawn between laity and clergy. And that's very practical, because that relates to your vocation. And people can say negative things about Martin Luther, and guess what? He deserves plenty of them. You can say things about John Calvin, and he deserves some too. But when you look at their theology of work and of vocation, it's very practical. It's very middle class, for lack of a better word. It's very helpful, and it's very real. When you read what they had to say about work, the beauty, the dignity, the way it glorifies God, the way it's part of what we are intended to do. And there's not this hard separation between there's the clergy, and here's us making bricks. No, 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 no. All to the glory of God. Now let's break that down. And that's exactly what they did. So this is very real Reformation. And my point is, that's social change. And even in the Reformation, you had that exact kind of thing. The peasants were like, yo, time to overthrow the Catholic hierarchy. So they revolted.
So that's I love that.
They got slaughtered though.
You got to do a show on that, Vocab.
Yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off. You got to do a show on that, because I think a lot of Calvinists are forgetting the history, the provenance of, you know, how that movement came about. And, you know, a lot of the prominent Protestants being Calvin, and people who, you know, adopted that theology he laid out. And Martin Luther really is the first one that really sparked it off. But they were really reforming, right? Something that was detrimental to the laity, right? And even their entrance into the kingdom that Yeshua was speaking to the Pharisees about, right? So I think that would be a great show for you to speak on and kind of explicate that, so that way it can, you know, it can resonate in your community, so that people can go back to the history and see why getting involved now with this reform would only, you know, pretty much you guys picking up the mantle of what the original Protestants were doing against the Roman Catholic Church. So that's all. I just want to say that. I'm done.
Of course, there's William Wilberforce. He was reformed. He was an abolitionist. He's greatly influenced by John Newton, an ex-slaver who wrote Amazing Grace, who was also reformed, and also told Newton, highly encouraged and told Wilberforce to stay in his position as a politician, because Wilberforce kept on wanting to leave politics and become a preacher or theologian. And Newton and a number of other people, but Newton was very influential. No, 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 right? You know, and so you see that. And even going back to the early Christians, the Romans had a view of children that was almost like they weren't people until they were of a certain age. And that's why you could dispose of them upon hills. And the Christians would adopt these children, and very similar with women and slaves. And not that all the early Christians were perfect, but there's a very interesting book about this. It's called When Children Became People. And it's about a revolution about how the Christians looked at children, for example. Can
you send that to me so I can, or the name of that so I can read that?
Yeah. And there's another one by William Webster. And again, you never agree with everything in every book, but it has to do with slaves and women as well. And these are very fascinating things about the real social change. And one of the later Roman emperors, Julian, he became known as Julian the Apostate, complained about it. He's like, well, these Christians are getting so many people to join their cause because they don't only take care of their sick and feed their hungry, they take care of our sick, and talk about the pagans, and feed our hungry. So he started competitive programs in the Roman government to compete with the church at their time. And it's easier to romanticize and lionize people of a bygone era. They had plenty of issues, but we point out the good. I think it's helpful as a model going forward. And so there does have to be some of that. I do think there's a danger in putting all your eggs in this temporal physical basket, though. And so I do think it needs to be tempered. And what I mean by that is there's a sort of element of wisdom and how we approach it. And we realize we fight and we work. At the end of the day, God is in charge, and everything will not be made a right until the eternal kingdom. But sometimes I hear people say this, and I'll say this last. Pray as if it all depends on God, and work as if it all depends on you. It's not biblical per se as a Bible verse, but it's not a bad way to look at it, maybe.
I agree. And thank you for your time. I thought this was an excellent build. And I think that if, both Israelites and Christians have dialogues like this, where you have mutual respect for the other person, even though you disagree, and you don't have to harbor hatred and bitterness when you speak, you can kind of flesh out each other's positions, and it makes it more edifying to the audience, right? So they don't hear just a shouting match and cutting each other off. And forgive me if I did cut you off. I was just trying to hone in on certain things you were saying so it could be clear to me and the audience before I left. So if I took up too much time, my apologies for that. But I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me your show. And then next time, I'll ask you a follow-up on Cotton Mather's. I don't know your position with him, but he wrote some interesting stuff, being a Calvinist, about Negroes or blacks. And
you can find all kinds of stuff there. When it comes
it's an essay to excite and assist that good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity. I think that needs to be trashed, and I think people should research that, because there are still some Calvinists today that hold that position. I'm glad that you don't. All right, so thank you for your time, Vocab. I appreciate it.
Hey, no doubt, man. Be blessed and have a beautiful day.